I'm Unity, 34 years old, and I've been secretly paying my parents' mortgage for 5 years now. No, they don't know. Well, Dad does, but Mum would rather lose the house than accept her daughter's help. That's just how she is. Always has been. But I never thought she'd actually tell me to get out and never come back. I never imagined my own mother would throw me away so easily after everything I've sacrificed. Before I tell you how I ended up secretly paying my parents' mortgage for years only to be kicked out, let me know where you're watching from and subscribe if you've ever dealt with ungrateful family members. Growing up, I had what most would consider a comfortable middle-class life. My parents, Margaret and Thomas, weren't wealthy, but we never lacked necessities. Dad owned a small construction company that did well enough for us to live in a nice neighborhood and take occasional vacations. Mum, well, she never worked outside the home, but considered managing our family's social status her full-time job. From my earliest memories, I understood that my mother was hard to please. When I brought home straight A's, she'd ask why I wasn't selected for the special academic program. When I made the volleyball team, she wondered why I wasn't the captain. Nothing was ever quite good enough. Dad was different. He'd beam with pride at my smallest accomplishments, but never in front of Mom. He'd give me a wink or a thumbs up behind her back, his way of saying he was proud without triggering another of Mum's lectures about how praise makes children weak. I remember sitting at our kitchen table one night when I was 14, struggling with geometry homework. Dad noticed my frustration and sat down to help. We were laughing about something when Mum walked in and frowned. Unity, if you spent less time giggling and more time studying, perhaps you wouldn't be struggling, she said, her voice sharp as a razor. Dad immediately stood up. I was just heading to the garage, he mumbled, avoiding conflict as always. That was their dynamic. Mum criticized, Dad retreated, and I learned to navigate the minefield of her expectations, always trying and never quite succeeding in making her proud. Despite the constant pressure, or perhaps because of it, I excelled academically. When college application time came around, I secured a full scholarship to Wellesley College. Mum finally seemed impressed, though she quickly pivoted to worrying about whether my wardrobe was sophisticated enough for such a prestigious school. College was freedom. For the first time, I could make decisions without hearing Mom's disapproving voice in my ear. I double majored in finance and economics, graduated summa cum laude, and landed a position at Goldman Sachs in their investment division. I was 22, living in New York, and finally feeling like I was building my own life. The first few years of my career were a whirlwind. I worked insane hours but learned so much. Each promotion came with greater responsibility and thankfully higher compensation. By 28, I had a comfortable apartment in Manhattan, a healthy investment portfolio, and the respect of my colleagues. From the outside, it looked like I was living the dream. Then came the call that changed everything. It was nearly midnight when my phone rang. Seeing Dad's name, I immediately worried something had happened to Mom. Dad, is everything okay? There was a long pause, then a shaky breath. Unity, sweetheart, I hate to bother you with this. What's wrong? I sat up in bed, fully alert now. It's nothing serious, he said unconvincingly. Your mother's fine. I'm fine. It's just... Another pause. The business has been struggling. The economy, you know. Construction's always the first to feel it. My stomach tightened. Dad never complained about business. How bad is it? We're behind on the mortgage. 3 months now. His voice cracked. The bank sent a foreclosure notice today. I felt like I'd been punched. My childhood home, the place where, despite Mum's criticism, I'd felt safe and loved by Dad. The thought of them losing it was unbearable. How much do you need? No. Dad quickly protested. I'm not calling for money. I just needed someone to talk to. Your mother doesn't know how bad it is. I've been hiding the notices. That was so typical. Dad protecting Mum from reality while carrying the burden alone. Dad, I can help. I've been doing well at work. Unity, we're talking about thousands of dollars. The mortgage is $2,800 a month and there are other debts. I can handle it, I said firmly. Let me do this. After much convincing, Dad reluctantly agreed to let me pay off the immediate arrears. What he didn't know was that I was already formulating a longer-term plan. I contacted the family attorney the next day and set up a trust that would make the mortgage payments directly to the bank. Dad would know the source, but on paper, it would look like the payments were coming from a family trust fund. Your mother can never know, Dad insisted when I explained the arrangement. She'd never accept it. You know how proud she is. I did know. Mum had always maintained the appearance that our family was financially secure, even when we weren't. The thought of her adult daughter paying their bills would be humiliating to her. So I agreed to the secret, not realizing how that decision would eventually blow up in my face. 6 months after setting up the mortgage payments, I made another major decision. I transferred from the New York office to a smaller branch of my firm back in my hometown of Hartford, Connecticut. The move came with a significant salary reduction, but I calculated that I could still afford to help my parents and live comfortably enough. Besides, I told myself being closer to them as they aged was the right thing to do. I found a modest 2-bedroom apartment about 15 minutes from my parents' house. It wasn't the doorman building I'd had in New York, but it was clean, safe, and conveniently located. I settled into a routine of work during the week and family dinners on Sundays. Dad seemed genuinely happy to have me back, his eyes lighting up whenever I walked through their door. Mum. Unity, you've gained weight since moving back, she noted during my first Sunday dinner. New York must have kept you more active, or maybe it's the stress of taking a step down in your career. I swallowed my retort along with my mashed potatoes and smiled. The food's better here, that's all. The family attorney, Scott Jenkins, helped me establish the payment structure. We set it up so that each month $2,800 would transfer from my account to the trust and then directly to the mortgage company. I also established an emergency fund for unexpected house repairs or medical bills. This is very generous of you, Scott said during our final meeting. But are you sure you want to commit to this indefinitely? It's a significant financial burden. They're my parents, I replied simply. I can't let them lose their home. What I didn't articulate even to myself fully then was that I was also buying something else my mother's approval, or at least trying to. Somehow I thought that by ensuring their financial security, even secretly, I might finally earn the warmth and acceptance she had always withheld. Dad was overwhelmed with gratitude when the foreclosure threat disappeared. I don't know how to thank you, he said, hugging me tightly one day when Mum was out shopping. Just don't tell Mum, I reminded him. Never, he promised. She thinks the bank restructured our loan due to my long customer history with them. Let's keep it that way. Meanwhile, Mum seemed utterly oblivious to how close they'd come to losing everything. In fact, once the financial pressure was off, she began spending more freely again. New furniture for the living room, a kitchen renovation, a 2-week cruise to Alaska. Isn't it wonderful how things work out? She commented during one Sunday dinner. Just when things were tight, our financial situation improved. God looks after good people, Unity. I nodded and took another bite of roast chicken, avoiding Dad's guilty glance. Outside of family obligations, I worked on building my life in Hartford. I reconnected with a few friends from high school who had also returned to the area. I joined a book club, took tennis lessons at the local rec centre, and even went on a few dates, though nothing serious developed. One particularly meaningful friendship was with Jasmine, my former college roommate, who had coincidentally moved to Hartford for a teaching position. Unlike my other friends, Jasmine knew the truth about my financial arrangement with my parents. I don't understand why you put up with your mum's attitude when you're literally keeping a roof over her head, she said one evening as we shared a bottle of wine in my apartment. I shrugged. It's complicated. She doesn't know, remember. Maybe she should know. Maybe then she'd appreciate you more. But I shook my head. That would just humiliate her. And honestly, it would probably make her resent me even more. The emotional toll of my situation grew heavier as months passed into years. Every time Mum made a dismissive comment about my apartment, so cozy, but don't you miss having a proper dining room? I bit my tongue, knowing that my proper dining room money was going toward her mortgage. Every time she questioned my career choices, I thought you were on the fast track at Goldman Unity. What happened? I swallowed my resentment. The first major confrontation came at my cousin's wedding. I'd chosen a simple navy blue dress that I thought was perfectly appropriate for the occasion. Mum took one look at me and sighed dramatically. Unity, that dress makes you look so washed out. And it's at least a season old, isn't it? I wish you'd consulted me before buying something so ordinary. Something in me snapped. My dress is fine, Mum. Not everything needs to be a fashion statement. Don't take that tone with me, she hissed. I'm only thinking of you. People judge based on appearance, and you're representing our family. I think I'm representing myself actually, I replied, walking away before she could respond. Dad found me later sitting alone at the edge of the reception. She means well, he said weakly. Does she, Dad? Does she really? He had no answer for that. As time passed, the tension between Mum and me grew more pronounced. Small incidents became more frequent, building toward what would eventually become our breaking point. My 34th birthday fell on a Tuesday. I didn't expect much fanfare, but I thought at least my parents would acknowledge it. I received a text from Dad in the morning. "Happy birthday, sweetheart. Love you." Nothing from Mum. When I stopped by their house that evening, thinking maybe they'd planned a small surprise, I found Mum deep in planning mode at the dining room table, surrounded by notepads and printed emails. "Oh, Unity, good timing," she said without looking up. "What do you think of a chocolate fountain for Amanda's engagement party?" Amanda was my cousin, the daughter of Mum's younger sister. Her engagement had been announced the previous weekend. "Sounds messy," I replied, hovering in the doorway. "No one mentioned my birthday today." Mum looked up, momentarily confused. "Is that today? I'm sorry I've been so focused on this party. You know how important it is to give Amanda the celebration she deserves." The same Amanda who had never once remembered my birthday in 30-plus years of being cousins. The same Amanda who Mum constantly held up as an example of what a proper young lady should be, despite her dropping out of 3 colleges and working at a job her father had created specifically for her. "Right," I said flatly. "Well, don't let me interrupt your planning." I left without another word, ignoring Dad's apologetic text that came 30 minutes later. "Your mother is stressed about the party. We'll celebrate this weekend, I promise." We never did. 2 months after the birthday incident, I received a significant promotion at work. I was named Head of Investment Strategy for the entire New England region, a position that came with a corner office and a team of 6 analysts reporting directly to me. I was ecstatic, and despite everything, wanted to share the news with my parents. I bought a bottle of champagne and drove to their house after work. Mum and Dad were watching television in the living room when I arrived. "I have news," I announced, holding up the bottle. "I got a major promotion today." Dad immediately stood up, his face breaking into a wide smile. "That's wonderful, Unity. I'm so proud of you." Mum nodded. "That's nice, dear." Speaking of good news, did you hear that Linda's son was accepted to medical school, top of his class at UConn, and now headed to Johns Hopkins? They're having a party next weekend. We should send a gift. Linda was our neighbor. Her son Kevin had been my classmate in high school, a perfectly nice guy who had never shown particular academic promise until apparently very recently. I stood there, champagne bottle growing warm in my hand, as Mum launched into a detailed account of Kevin's accomplishments. Dad caught my eye and mouthed, "I'm sorry," behind Mum's back. That night, I left the unopened champagne on their kitchen counter and drove home fighting tears. I called Jasmine from my car. She couldn't even acknowledge my promotion for 1 minute before changing the subject to someone else's kid, I vented. "Unity, you need to stop seeking her approval," Jasmine said gently. "It's never going to come, at least not in the way you want it." "I know, you're right, it's just... they're my parents. And I'm doing so much for them. Maybe that's part of the problem. You're doing too much with no appreciation." Dad's health began declining around this time. Nothing dramatic, just the accumulation of years of stress and poor self-care. High blood pressure, pre-diabetic symptoms, chronic back pain from decades in construction. Mum predictably handled his health issues by alternatively ignoring them and using them as currency in her social circles, collecting sympathy for her difficult situation. Despite visiting my parents almost daily to check on Dad and often picking up his prescriptions or driving him to doctor appointments, Mum frequently complained to relatives that I wasn't present enough during this difficult time. Unity has always been so focused on her career. I overheard her telling her sister on the phone, "Thomas needs more support than she's willing to give." This while I was literally in their kitchen preparing meals for the week because Mum was too busy planning another social event to cook for Dad's new low-sodium diet. The resentment grew festering like an untreated wound, but I continued the mortgage payments. Every month, $2,800. Transferred from my account, maintaining a house where I increasingly felt unwelcome. During the holiday season, Mum orchestrated what would become one of our most disastrous family gatherings. Without warning me in advance, she invited Jackson, my ex-boyfriend from 3 years prior, to Christmas dinner. The same Jackson who had cheated on me with his co-worker, then blamed me for being emotionally unavailable due to my work commitments. I walked into the living room and froze when I saw him chatting comfortably with Dad. "Unity." Jackson stood up, smiling as though our breakup had been amicable. "Your mom said you'd be surprised to see me." I turned to find Mom watching with satisfaction from the doorway. "Jackson was alone for the holidays," she explained innocently. "No one should be alone at Christmas." Later. After an excruciating dinner where Jackson reminisced about our relationship while I silently seethed, I confronted Mom in the kitchen. How could you invite him without asking me first? You know he cheated on me. Mum sniffed dismissively as she rinsed dishes. That was years ago, Unity. You're too sensitive. Besides, he's from a good family and has been asking about you. You're not getting any younger, you know. That's not the point, I insisted. It was humiliating. Everything is always about your feelings, she sighed. Sometimes I think New York made you even more selfish than you were before. I left early that night. Jackson's business card crumpled in my coat pocket where Mom had slipped it when she thought I wasn't looking. The next day, I met with my therapist, Dr. Patterson, whom I'd been seeing monthly since moving back to Hartford. I recounted the Christmas dinner disaster along with the ongoing pattern of disrespect from my mother. Unity, we've talked before about your financial support of your parents, Dr. Patterson said carefully. Have you considered that maintaining the secret is contributing to the dysfunctional dynamic? What do you mean? Your mother treats you dismissively while unknowingly depending on you financially. You resent her behavior but continue enabling her lifestyle. It creates an unhealthy power imbalance that neither of you is acknowledging. I sat with that uncomfortable truth. So you think I should tell her? I think honesty might be the first step toward a healthier relationship, or at least toward you setting better boundaries. I nodded but made no commitments. The thought of confronting my mother with the truth terrified me. Not because I feared her anger, but because some part of me still craved her approval, still hoped that someday I would do enough, be enough to earn her love. The final straw came in early spring. I arrived for Sunday dinner to find Mum excitedly showing Dad brochures for luxury kitchen appliances. The contractor says we can start next month, she was saying. The Viking range alone is a statement piece, and the Sub-Zero refrigerator will completely transform the space. Dad looked uncomfortable. Margaret, I'm not sure now is the time for another renovation. The bathroom update last year was expensive enough. Mum waved away his concern. We're fine financially. Besides, the Andersons just redid their kitchen, and ours looks positively dated in comparison. I stood in the doorway, mental calculations running through my head. The appliances she was describing would cost at least $20,000, not including installation and other renovation expenses. Mom, I said carefully, that sounds like a major investment. Are you sure it's in the budget right now? She looked at me with irritation. Unity, don't worry about our finances. Focus on your own. In fact, you might want to consider upgrading your own place. Jasmine mentioned you're still using the furniture from your first apartment. The fact that she'd been discussing my living situation with my friend behind my back was infuriating enough, but what pushed me over the edge was what she said next as she turned back to her brochures. I saw on social media that you donated to that women's shelter fundraiser. $5,000. Really, Unity, I don't understand why you waste money on strangers when you could be investing in a better home for yourself. Sunday dinners at my parents' house always followed the same script. Mum would cook a traditional meal, we'd sit at the formal dining table with the good china, and conversation would revolve around neighborhood gossip, relatives' achievements, and subtle criticisms of my life choices. That particular Sunday seemed no different at first. The table was set with the familiar floral patterned plates that had been a wedding gift to my parents 35 years earlier. A pot roast with carrots and potatoes steamed in the center of the table, surrounded by side dishes in matching serving bowls. Dad poured wine while Mum brought in the final dish, a green bean casserole topped with crispy onions. Unity, you could help instead of just sitting there, she commented as she placed the casserole on the table. I bit back the reminder that I'd offered to help when I arrived and had been shooed out of the kitchen. Everything looks delicious, Mom, I said instead, the practiced response of years of keeping the peace. Dad cleared his throat. Let's say grace. We bowed our heads as Dad recited the same blessing he'd said before every meal of my childhood. When he finished, Mum immediately began serving passing plates around the table. The Morgans just got back from their Mediterranean cruise, she announced as we began eating. 16 days, can you imagine? Barbara said the Greek islands were just magnificent. That sounds wonderful, I replied automatically. We should consider something like that, Mum continued looking at Dad. Now that our finances have stabilized, we deserve a proper vacation. It's been ages since we traveled internationally. Dad shifted uncomfortably in his seat. A cruise is expensive, Margaret. We've been blessed financially these past few years, Mum said with the air of someone discussing a miracle. Our mortgage refinanced at that wonderful rate, investments performing well. She trailed off, then added, we should enjoy God's blessings while we can. Something in her casual entitlement. The easy way she discussed spending money that was actually mine struck a nerve. I took a slow sip of water before responding. You know, Mom, gratitude is important when you receive blessings, acknowledging the source of good things in your life. Mum looked at me sharply. Are you implying I'm not grateful I thank the Lord every day for providing for us? I just mean that sometimes we benefit from others' generosity without realizing it. I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite my racing heart. And appreciation matters in all relationships. What are you talking about? Mum put down her fork, her expression darkening. If this is about that charity comment earlier, I was only suggesting you think about your own future. You've always been so sensitive. It's not about the charity, I said. Though of course it partly was. It's about respect and acknowledgement. Respect, Mum's voice rose slightly. You want to lecture me about respect? The way you waltz in here every Sunday judging our lifestyle while you live in that tiny apartment with your second-hand furniture, acting superior because you work in finance, Dad interjected. Margaret, please. Unity doesn't. No, Thomas, I'm tired of her subtle comments and superior attitude, Mum interrupted. She's been different since moving back from New York, as if taking a step down in her career gives her the right to question our choices. The irony was almost laughable. A step down in my career, Mum, I took that transfer to be closer to you and Dad. I took a significant pay cut to move back here. No one asked you to, Mum snapped. We were doing fine before you decided to play the dutiful daughter. I put down my napkin, suddenly calm in the face of her escalating anger. You weren't doing fine, Mom. You were 3 months from foreclosure when I moved back. The room went silent. Dad closed his eyes briefly, knowing what was coming. What are you talking about? Mum asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Your mysterious financial blessing, the miraculous refinance that saved your home. That was me, Mom. I've been paying your mortgage for 5 years. Every month, $2,800 plus extra for taxes and insurance. Mum's face went through a rapid succession of emotions. Confusion, disbelief, and then something darker. That's ridiculous. Thomas, tell her that's ridiculous. Dad stared at his plate, saying nothing. Dad, Mum turned to him, her voice rising. Tell her she's lying. She's not lying, Margaret. Dad finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mum's hand flew to her mouth. You knew about this. You've been conspiring behind my back. The bank was going to take the house, Dad explained, still not meeting her eyes. Unity offered to help. I was going to lose everything, Margaret. My business was failing. We were drowning in debt. So you made us charity cases. Mum stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. You let our daughter pay our bills like we're some sort of paupers. Mum, it wasn't charity, I tried to explain. It was family helping family. Family doesn't humiliate each other, she hissed. Family doesn't go behind each other's backs for years lying about something this significant. I didn't tell you because I knew you'd react exactly like this. I said, my own anger finally surfacing. Because you care more about appearances than reality. You'd rather lose your home than admit you needed help. And you'd rather play the savior than be honest, Mum shot back. Secretly paying our bills so you can feel superior while judging how we spend money that you clearly think is yours. That's not fair, I protested. I never asked for acknowledgement or gratitude. I just wanted to help. Help! Mum laughed bitterly. Is that what you call this ambush? This humiliation? Margaret, Dad tried again. Unity has been incredibly generous. We owe her nothing, Mum shouted, slamming her hand on the table, making the dishes jump. If she chose to waste her money without our knowledge or consent, that's her problem. I stood up slowly, suddenly exhausted. Mum, I didn't tell you to make you feel bad or to demand gratitude. I told you because I'm tired of being treated like my choices, my life, my priorities don't matter while I'm financially supporting yours. Mum's face contorted with rage. You think paying some bills gives you the right to disrespect me in my own home, to question how I live my life. No, Mum, being your daughter should give me the right to be treated with basic respect, regardless of financial arrangements. Respect, she scoffed. You've always been ungrateful for everything I've done for you. I sacrificed my career to raise you. I gave you every advantage. And this is how you repay me, with secrets and judgments. Mum, please, I said, suddenly close to tears. That's not what this is about. I know exactly what this is about, she spat. You're ungrateful. You always have been. Get out and never come back. The words hung in the air between us. Dad sat frozen, his face ashen. Margaret, he finally said. You don't mean that. I absolutely mean it. she replied, her voice ice cold. If Unity thinks she's too good for this family, she can leave. Now. I looked at Dad, silently pleading for him to say something to defend me. But he just sat there, conflict written across his face, trapped as always between his wife's rage and his daughter's pain. In that moment, I made my decision. Without another word, I picked up my purse from the side table, walked to the front door, and left. I didn't take any possessions, didn't make any grand declarations. I simply walked out to my car, got in, and drove away, tears streaming down my face, as I realized that 5 years and nearly $200,000 had bought me nothing but the confirmation of what I'd always feared in my mother's eyes: I would never be enough. The digital clock on my car dashboard read 7:43 p.m. when I pulled into the parking lot of the Marriott Hotel downtown. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my key twice before successfully locking my car. Inside the lobby, I must have looked as shell-shocked as I felt, because the receptionist asked if I was okay as she processed my check-in. Just tired, I managed to reply, accepting the key card with a trembling hand. Once inside the anonymous safety of room 412, I collapsed onto the bed and finally let myself break down completely. The sobs tore through me with physical force, years of suppressed hurt and disappointment pouring out all at once. I cried until my throat was raw and my eyes swollen, until the fancy decorative pillow beneath my face was soaked with tears and mascara. When the storm of emotion finally subsided, I fumbled for my phone and called the one person I knew would understand. Jasmine, it happened. Everything fell apart. Can you come? 40 minutes later, Jasmine arrived with a pint of ice cream, a bottle of wine, and the unwavering support of true friendship. She listened without interruption as I recounted the disastrous dinner, the revelation, and my mother's devastating final words. You're better off without that toxicity in your life, Jasmine said when I finished pouring me another glass of wine. I know it doesn't feel like it now, but this might be the healthiest thing that could have happened. I just can't believe she told me to never come back, I whispered. Her own daughter. Some people are incapable of acknowledging when they're wrong, Jasmine replied. Your mother's pride is more important to her than your relationship. And Dad just sat there. He didn't defend me at all. Jasmine squeezed my hand. Your father is weak, Unity. He always has been where your mother is concerned. That doesn't mean he doesn't love you. That night, Jasmine stayed with me in the hotel room, refusing to leave me alone in my fragile state. In the morning, she helped me formulate a plan for the immediate future. First, I extended my stay at the hotel for a week while I looked for a new apartment. My current lease was almost up anyway, and I couldn't bear the thought of staying in a place my mother had repeatedly criticized. I needed a fresh start, a space untainted by her judgment. Second, I threw myself into work, grateful for the distraction of complex financial analyses and investment strategies. My assistant, concerned by my red-rimmed eyes, asked if everything was all right. I gave her the simplified version: family disagreement, temporary housing situation, nothing to worry about. Take anything personal off my calendar for the next few weeks, I instructed her. I need to focus on the Carson portfolio launch. The third day after leaving my parents' house, my phone buzzed with a text from Dad. Your mother didn't mean what she said. Please call me. I stared at the message for a long time before simply turning off my phone without responding. It was too soon. The wound was still too fresh, and I knew that any conversation with Dad would inevitably include pressure to apologize to Mom for the sake of family peace, regardless of who was actually at fault. By the end of the week, I'd signed a lease on a beautiful 2-bedroom condo in a renovated historic building downtown. It was significantly nicer than my previous apartment, with high ceilings, hardwood floors, and large windows overlooking a small park. I furnished it thoughtfully, not with the expensive designer pieces Mum would have preferred, but with items that brought me joy: a butter yellow sofa, bookshelves filled with my favourite novels, and artwork from local artists I'd discovered at the weekend market. As I settled into my new home, I made another significant decision. I stopped the mortgage payments. There was no dramatic cancellation, no notification to my parents. I simply called Scott Jenkins and instructed him to halt the trust disbursements effective immediately. Are you sure about this, Unity? Scott asked, concern evident in his voice. It's a substantial change. I'm sure, I replied firmly. They'll need to make other arrangements going forward. What I didn't tell Scott was that I'd already calculated that my parents had approximately 6 weeks before the missed mortgage payment would trigger a notice from the bank. 6 weeks for them to figure out that their financial blessing had disappeared along with their daughter. The weeks that followed were a strange mixture of pain and liberation. I found myself breathing more freely in my new space, making decisions without the constant shadow of my mother's potential disapproval. I resumed therapy sessions with Dr. Patterson, now meeting weekly instead of monthly, working through the complex emotions of family estrangement. What you're experiencing is a form of grief, Dr. Patterson explained during one session. You're mourning the relationship you wanted with your mother, the recognition and love you deserved but didn't receive. Will it always hurt this much? I asked. The pain will change over time, she replied gently. Right now it's raw and overwhelming. Eventually, it will become something you carry with you, but it won't define you. I also joined a support group for adults dealing with difficult family relationships. Listening to others share similar experiences helped me understand that I wasn't alone, that my mother's behavior reflected her own issues rather than my worth as a daughter or as a person. Meanwhile, I rediscovered parts of myself that had been suppressed in the effort to win my mother's approval. I took a pottery class, something I'd always wanted to try, but had dismissed as impractical. I reconnected with college friends I'd lost touch with, planning a weekend trip to New York to visit former colleagues. I even went on a few dates with Michael, a kind architectural historian I met at a museum fundraiser, allowing myself to be open to connection in a way I hadn't been for years. The financial recalibration was significant as well. Without the burden of my parents' mortgage, I had an additional $2,800 each month. Some of it went toward my new, slightly higher rent, but I also increased my charitable giving and started a special fund for a long-held dream, opening a financial literacy center for women leaving abusive relationships. 3 weeks passed with no contact from my parents. Dad's texts had stopped after I failed to respond to the first few. I checked their social media occasionally and saw that at least publicly, life seemed to continue normally. Mum posted photos of garden club meetings and church events, maintaining the facade of perfect family life that had always been so important to her. I was in my office reviewing quarterly projections when my phone lit up with a text notification. It was from Dad, and the content made my heart race. Unity, why haven't you paid the mortgage? I stared at the message, a complex mix of emotions washing over me. So the bank had sent the first late notice. I imagined the scene at home, Mum opening the mail, the confusion followed by realization. Dad's panic, perhaps a heated argument about what to do. After careful consideration, I typed my response. Oh, I thought I wasn't welcome. I pressed send and placed my phone face down on my desk, returning my attention to the spreadsheet on my computer screen. But concentration was impossible now. Within minutes, my phone began to vibrate continuously as messages poured in. From Dad, Unity please, we need to talk about this. From Mum, the first direct communication since that night. This is extremely immature behavior. You can't just stop payments without warning. From Dad again, the bank says we're late. Will there be penalties? Please call me. Then the voicemail started. Mum's voice tight with barely controlled fury. Unity, whatever point you're trying to make, this is not the way to do it. This affects our credit and our standing in the community. Call your father immediately. Another from Mum, more threatening this time. If you think this childish financial manipulation will force an apology from me, you are sorely mistaken. I raised you better than this. I let the messages accumulate without responding, continuing with my workday as normally as possible. It wasn't until I was driving home that evening that my phone rang again. This time I answered. Unity. It was Dad, his voice uncharacteristically firm. We need to talk. Not tomorrow, not next week, tonight. I'm listening, I replied neutrally. Not on the phone, in person. Your mother and I both need to speak with you. I hesitated mentally, assessing whether I was emotionally prepared for another confrontation. I don't think that's a good idea right now, Dad. Unity, Dad said, and I was surprised to hear an edge in his typically placating tone. Margaret, she was paying our mortgage all along. There was a muffled sound as if he'd covered the phone, followed by what sounded like raised voices in the background. When Dad returned to the line, his voice was quieter, but still determined. Please, Unity, just meet us. Neutral ground. The coffee shop near your office, maybe. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Tomorrow at noon, I have an hour lunch break. That's it. We'll be there, Dad promised. And Unity, thank you. The next day, I arrived at Riverside Coffee 10 minutes early, choosing a table in the corner that offered some privacy without being completely isolated. I ordered a large latte and weighted my stomach in knots, despite my outward composure. At exactly noon, my parents walked in. Mum looked immaculate as always, not a hair out of place, wearing one of her designer pantsuits. Dad looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than I remembered. They spotted me and approached Mum's expression, guarded Dad attempting an encouraging smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Unity. Dad greeted me, leaning down to kiss my cheek. Mum remained standing, making no move to embrace me. Sit, please, I said, gesturing to the empty chairs. Would you like to order something first? We're not here for coffee, Mum replied curtly, though she did take a seat. Dad cleared his throat. What your mother means is that we're here to discuss the mortgage situation. I nodded, waiting for them to continue. The bank sent a notice, Dad explained unnecessarily. The payment is 2 weeks late now. There will be fees, and if we don't resolve it quickly, it could affect our credit score. I understand how mortgage payments work, Dad, I replied evenly. Then you understand why this is serious, Mum interjected. Whatever disagreement we had doesn't justify putting our home at risk. I took a slow sip of my latte before responding. You told me to get out and never come back, Mum. You made it very clear that I wasn't welcome in your life anymore. I simply took you at your word. That was said in the heat of the moment, Mum dismissed with a wave of her hand. Families argue. It doesn't mean you stop paying obligations you've committed to. Obligations. I repeated, my voice rising slightly before I controlled it. Mom, I was making a gift, not fulfilling an obligation. There was no contract, no agreement. I chose to help, and now I'm choosing not to. Mum's face hardened. So this is punishment. Financial manipulation to force an apology. No, Mom, this is a boundary. You can't tell me I'm not welcome in your life, but still expect me to financially support your lifestyle. Margaret? Dad interrupted, placing his hand on Mum's arm. Let's calm down. We're here to resolve this, not make it worse. He turned to me, his expression pleading. Unity, we appreciate everything you've done for us. More than we can say. What happened at dinner was terrible, and your mother regrets her words. I looked at Mum, whose expression suggested she regretted nothing. Dad, I love you, but I'm not going to continue enabling a relationship that's harmful to me. For 5 years, I've been supporting you financially, while Mum has consistently undermined and criticised me. That stops now. So you'll let us lose our home? Mum asked, her voice rising. After all we've done for you. You won't lose your home if you make the payments yourselves, I pointed out. Sell some of those luxury kitchen appliances you were planning to buy. Cancel the Mediterranean cruise. Live within your actual means. Mum stood up abruptly. I won't be lectured about financial responsibility by my own daughter. This is absolutely... Margaret, sit down, Dad said with unexpected firmness. Mum stared at him in shock. Sit down and listen for once in your life. Stunned, Mum slowly sank back into her chair. Dad turned to me, his eyes filled with regret. Unity, I failed you. I've always failed to stand up when your mother treated you unfairly. I convinced myself it was easier to keep the peace, but all I did was allow you to be hurt over and over again. Mum started to speak, but Dad raised his hand to silence her. No, Margaret. You've said enough. Now it's my turn. He looked back at me. I cannot express how grateful I am for what you've done for us. Not just the mortgage, but moving back here, checking on us, being present, despite how difficult your mother made it. Tears welled in my eyes at this unexpected acknowledgement. If you choose to stop the payments, that's your right, Dad continued. We'll figure something out. Downsize, finally sell that house that's too big for us anyway. But I hope... His voice cracked. I hope that doesn't mean you're out of our lives for good. For the first time, I saw genuine emotion on Mum's face. Not anger, not indignation, but fear. The fear of consequences finally catching up to her after years of avoiding them. I don't want to be estranged from you, I said quietly, but I need certain things to change if we're going to have a relationship going forward. What things? Mum asked, her voice unusually subdued. Respect, appreciation, no more criticism or comparisons, and I think... I hesitated, then pressed on. I think you should consider therapy, Mum, both individually and as a family with Dad. There are patterns here that need to be addressed professionally. Mum looked as though I'd suggested she run naked through the town square. Therapy. There's nothing wrong with me that requires... Margaret? Dad interrupted again. Just listen. The coffee shop meeting marked the beginning of a new chapter in my relationship with my parents. I outlined clear terms for moving forward, respect for my life choices, no more, unnecessary criticism, family counselling, and a complete restructuring of our financial relationship. I won't continue making your mortgage payments, I explained firmly, but I am willing to help you refinance at a rate you can manage with Dad's pension and Social Security. You'll need to downsize your lifestyle significantly. Mum's initial reaction was predictably resistant. This is humiliating, she muttered. Having my daughter dictate financial terms to me like I'm some irresponsible child. It's not dictating, Mom, I replied calmly. It's establishing healthy boundaries. The choice is yours whether to accept them. To my surprise, Dad became the primary advocate for accepting my terms. Perhaps my departure had finally forced him to find his voice after decades of deferring to Mum's stronger personality. We'll do it, he said, overriding Mum's objections. The therapist, the financial changes, all of it. I'm not losing my daughter over pride or stubbornness. The first few weeks were awkward and strained. I helped them meet with a mortgage broker who outlined their options given their fixed income. They ultimately decided to sell their 4-bedroom house and purchase a smaller townhome in a nearby community, significantly reducing their monthly housing costs. Mum resisted the move, initially concerned about what her friends would think. Everyone will know we're downsizing because of financial problems, she fretted during one of our discussions. Or they'll think you're sensibly right-sizing now that you're empty nesters, I pointed out. Perception is about the story you choose to tell, Mom. You've always been good at managing appearances. That framing appealed to her, and soon she was enthusiastically describing their move to friends as embracing a simpler lifestyle and reducing our environmental footprint. The family therapy sessions were more challenging. We began meeting with Dr. Eleanor Ramirez, a family counselor specializing in adult parent-child relationships. The first session was nearly disastrous, with Mum storming out after Dr. Ramirez suggested she might have narcissistic tendencies. I will not be labelled by some woman with a degree from an online university, she declared. Dr. Ramirez had graduated from Harvard, a fact Mum had conveniently ignored. But Dad convinced her to return for the second session, and slowly, painfully, we began the work of unpacking decades of dysfunctional patterns. Mum's need for status and perfection, Dad's conflict avoidance, my desperate attempts to earn love through achievement and financial support. Your mother experienced significant emotional neglect in her own childhood, Dr. Ramirez explained to me during a one-on-one session. Her critical behavior toward you is a manifestation of her own deep insecurities, not a reflection of your worth. Understanding the roots of Mum's behavior didn't excuse it, but it did help me develop compassion while maintaining boundaries. And to my surprise, Mum herself began to show small but meaningful signs of change. The first came after about 2 months of therapy. We were having dinner at their new townhome, a weekly tradition we'd cautiously re-established. I mentioned a challenging project at work that I'd successfully completed. That's impressive unity, Mum said, and then added something I'd never heard from her before. I'm proud of you. I nearly dropped my fork in shock. Dad beamed from across the table, clearly aware of the significance of this moment. Thank you, Mum, I managed to reply. Later, as I was helping clear the dishes, Mum said quietly, Dr. Ramirez suggested I practice acknowledging your accomplishments. It feels strange, but I'm trying. I appreciate that, I said sincerely. Dad found his voice in other ways. He began standing up to Mom's more unreasonable demands, calmly but firmly setting his own boundaries. No, Margaret, we cannot buy new furniture for the guest room. It's not in our budget, I overheard him saying during one visit. Rather than the typical argument that would have ensued in the past, Mum actually seemed to accept his decision with minimal protest. Meanwhile, my own life continued to flourish. My investment strategies for our regional clients earned recognition from corporate headquarters. I expanded my volunteer work with the Women's Shelter, developing a financial literacy curriculum that helped women establish economic independence after leaving abusive situations. And my relationship with Michael, the architectural historian, deepened into something meaningful. Unlike previous partners who had found my drive intimidating or my family situation too complicated, Michael appreciated my strength and supported me through the ongoing family healing process. You're handling this with incredible grace, he told me one evening as I recounted a particularly difficult therapy session. Setting boundaries while still choosing forgiveness isn't easy. I'm not sure I've completely forgiven her yet, I admitted. Forgiveness is a process, not an event, he replied. What matters is that you're choosing your own well-being while still leaving room for reconciliation. 6 months after the confrontation that had changed everything, our family dynamic had transformed. Not perfectly, not completely, but significantly. Mum still occasionally slipped into old critical patterns, but now I had the confidence to address them directly. Mum, that comment about my hair was unnecessary and hurtful, I might say. And remarkably, instead of becoming defensive, she would often acknowledge it. "You're right, I apologize." Dad continued to find his voice not just with Mum, but in reclaiming his own interests that had long been suppressed. He joined a local veterans group, reconnecting with his military service that had always been a source of pride, before Mum had deemed it not suitable conversation for dinner parties. As for me, I learned that walking away had been necessary not just for my own healing, but for our entire family system to reset. By refusing to continue in the dysfunctional pattern, I had created space for something healthier to emerge. One evening, as we finished another family dinner, Mum surprised me again. "Unity," she said, uncharacteristically hesitant. "I've been thinking about what you said months ago about gratitude being important." I nodded, waiting. "I haven't been grateful enough," she continued. "Not just for the financial help, though, that was extraordinary, but for everything. Your patience, your forgiveness, your willingness to try again with us." She reached across the table and took my hand, an unusual gesture of physical affection from her. "I'm grateful for you, Unity, for the daughter you are, not for what you do for us. I should have told you that long ago." Tears pricked my eyes. It wasn't a perfect apology or complete transformation, but it was genuine progress. "Thank you, Mum. That means a lot to me." Later, as Michael and I walked through the park near my condo, I reflected on everything that had happened since that explosive Sunday dinner. "It's still hard sometimes," I admitted. "There are moments when I see Mom slipping into old patterns and I brace myself for the criticism. Change takes time," Michael reminded me, "for all of you." "I know, and there's one thing I've realized through all this," I said, stopping to face him. "Sometimes walking away is the strongest act of love you can show someone, both for yourself and for them." "How so?" he asked. "By leaving, I finally forced my parents to confront reality, their finances, their marriage dynamic, Mum's controlling behavior. None of that would have changed if I'd continued enabling the situation." Michael nodded. "You created the opportunity for growth by refusing to participate in patterns that weren't serving any of you." "Exactly. I learned that true love requires respect and gratitude. It took drastic measures to get there, but we're building something healthier now, something real instead of the facade we maintained for years." As we continued our walk, I felt a profound sense of peace. The journey had been painful, the confrontations difficult, but the transformation, my own personal transformation, from enabler to empowered, was worth every difficult moment. I had learned that family obligation has limits, that financial support without emotional respect creates toxic dependency, and most importantly, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do when someone tells you to leave is to actually go, not out of anger or revenge, but out of self-respect and the hope that distance might eventually lead to healing. Have you ever had to walk away from someone you love to protect your own well-being? Or have you been in a situation where you felt unappreciated despite giving your all? Share your experience in the comments below. Remember that setting boundaries isn't selfish, it's necessary for healthy relationships. If my story resonated with you, please like and subscribe for more real-life experiences. Thank you for listening, and remember, sometimes the most loving thing you can do is love yourself enough to say no.